hello. I am Chelsea Hayes, Director of Student Involvement. My pronouns are she, her, and hers.
I'm Vinny Malomo. I'm an anthropology professor and chair of the Department of Culture, History, and Politics. Pronouns him, his, and he.
And we are super excited to chat with you all today. Our topic today is From Stereotypes to Hate Crimes, Understanding the Challenges of the Apida Community. Before we get started, there we go. Do want to start with a land and labor acknowledgement. So I would like to take a moment to honor the land beneath us. The land that William Peace University sits on is land that was originally stewarded to two indigenous tribes, the Tuscarora and the Catawba tribes. We honor these tribes today by recognizing that this institution of higher education is built on land stolen from those who were here before the colonizers arrived. Additionally, this land has borne witness to over 400 years of the enslavement, torture, and systemic mistreatment of African people and their descendants. We honor these people today by recognizing them in order to break the cycle of colonization and the continued erasure of Indigenous and Black peoples. We must acknowledge the history of the spaces and places we occupy to both understand and unlearn the many ways that we have been socialized. So thank you all for listening to this. There's some great information out there around the Tuscarora and Catawba tribes. So I hope that you will take a little bit more of a look at that. Before we get started, since we have a small group, I would love to do introductions of everyone here as well. And then we will kind of just go over some community guidelines. So Leah, if you don't mind starting us off with introductions, that would be great.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm Leah. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I just started, 3 months ago now, maybe 4 months. I don't know. Time's relative at this point. But I'm happy to be here, excited to learn.
Kayla.
Hey, everybody. I'm Kayla Beavers. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director of HR.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we will get started just by going over a few community guidelines for our conversation today. The first is, this is a space for honesty. So we hope that you will share your honest ideas and be as transparent as you feel comfortable being. Speak in I statements. So trying to do our best to not overgeneralize is going to be great for our discussion today. Listen to understand and not to respond. That kind of goes into taking a pause. So that will help us with that listening. Do not interrupt and respect other opinions. We are more than open to providing any feedback to one another, to the facilitators today. We do welcome that. Allow for curiosity. So this is a learning space and we hope that you will be open to that. Lean into discomfort. And what is shared here stays here, but what is learned here leaves here. So if anyone's sharing anything personal, this is a brave space, and we just ask that you take the knowledge with you.
Okay, so we were going to start by defining the term Apida. It's not, I'll be honest, actually, as someone who is studied Asian Americans and ethnic study in the U.S., for a while. Apida was still a relatively new concept for me. The elements weren't, but putting it all together was something relatively new. And it's basically a concept that's meant to be as inclusive as possible of various peoples from Asia, from the Pacific Islands, from South Asia, communities. If I can back up there just 1 second. I can't. The previous slide. There we go. And just this is going to be the challenge of doing of participating in a session like this is that, as we're going to emphasize 100 times over, is that the incredible diversity of the geography and the peoples tied to that geography that we're talking about. There is no way to generalize in any way appropriately. And also speaking as someone who's not of that, of these groups, right? I mean, that's its own challenge too. But as you can see from the countries listed under Asian America, the places listed under Pacific Island American, and the countries listed under DAISY or South Asian American, it includes just an incredible variety of places. Next. So when I do teach about Asian Americans broadly and Pacific Island communities in South Asia as connected to all of that, the simple point that I always try to start with that I think is critical for members not of those communities to understand is basically that that American history has always been tied to Asia and has always been about looking to Asia, right? Columbus came to what comes to be called the New World and thinks he finds people that come to be called Indians because he's trying to get to Asia and thinks he got to Asia. Lewis and Clark in exploring the Louisiana Purchase and the Columbia and Missouri rivers were basically trying to find a passage to the Pacific in order to, find connections to Asia. So just in a very broad way, just recognizing that from the earliest parts of American history, we were connected to Asia. There was a lot of immigration from Asia that came in the 19th century. And I think this is important to emphasize simply because there's a lot of recent immigration from Asia that very much defines the community today. But particularly in the American West, those communities have been there as long as any other communities have been there, except for Native American ones. And in fact, those key sort of developments and moments that define the West, like the gold rush, like the construction of railroads, like the developing of agriculture in places like California, those were all tied to Asian American history. That those all drew immigrants from across the Pacific as much as they drew immigrants from the East Coast. 20th century happenings, American imperialism and warfare brought the U.S. or what was the U.S. or aspects of the U.S. into connection with different places and peoples in Asia. The Spanish-American War, kind of oddly enough, was key to a lot of these connections. At the end of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. became an occupier of the Philippines. It's how the U.S. First had influence in Hawaii and Guam, Pacific Island places that become part of the United States, right? So late 19th century and then throughout the 20th century, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, the U.S. is connected to these places in very significant and dramatic ways, mainly militarily, but politically and economically too. And part of all this is to say, that it's a bit of a peculiar phrasing, but the idea that, they're here because we're there, right? That it's not simply that people from other parts of the world came here without connection. They broadly, different Asian Pacific Islanders and Desis came here in large part because of our activities and connections, to those places as the country broadly. And then the late 20th and 21st century is really where we've seen like the largest increase in growth of the Apida community of immigration from South Asia, from East Asia, from the Pacific Islands, and that's tied to globalization, right? That's tied to increasing economic and cultural connections in all sorts of ways, that we all see and live with today. So just trying to emphasize that, while there's a recency to the Apida community in the U.S. In a certain sense, there are Apida communities in the U.S. that have been here, literally for hundreds of years at this point, and have always been here because of broad connections that the U.S. has had at different points in its history to all sorts of different places. Next. Yeah, so these are just some stats to highlight, some of the bigger points and import really of talking about this. There are as many as 20 million Asian Americans or more broadly Apida community members in the U.S. People who trace their descent to those places, East and Southeast Asian, Indian subcontinent, and all with unique aspects linguistically, culturally, etc. The fastest growth rate of any major racial or ethnic group in the U.S. has been among Asian Americans in recent years. And in time, they'll likely be the largest immigrant community in the United States. So there's overall the percentage is about 6% of the U.S. population, but dramatic growth there. And though there is incredible diversity among those sort of places of national origin, Chinese, Indian, and Filipino are the largest ones. And so, yeah, this is just restating again, diversity, diversity, diversity cannot generalize any sort of way. You know, some folks are part of sort of communities that immigrated 150 years ago. Some people are immigrants who came, you know, in the past year. Some folks have citizenship because they are from Guam and Hawaii and places that are part of the United States. They come from different countries, different languages, different religious backgrounds, different socioeconomic status shapes experience dramatically in the US, the time at which a particular community immigrated, and where they settled in the US. The Asian American story is largely really a Western story, a story, you know, tied to the American West, though there are many other examples too. But where one lives in the US, you know, significantly shapes that experience as well.
All right, so now we are going to show you a video that is a few minutes long. It's a really great video. And after that, we will kind of just discuss your initial thoughts, anything that you noticed that maybe you've heard before, just some great things about this video that will help us further our discussion. Please let me know if you can hear this.
My name is Canwin, and I play both the piano and the violin. I aspire to someday be a doctor, and my favorite subject is calculus. My mom and dad are tiger parents who won't let me go to sleepovers, but they make up for it by serving my favorite meal every single day, rice. And I'm a really bad driver. So my question for you now is, how long did it take you to figure out I was joking? As you've probably guessed, today I'm going to talk about race, and I'll start off by sharing with you my story of growing up Asian American. I moved to the United States when I was 2 years old, so almost my entire life has been a blend of two cultures. I eat pasta with chopsticks, am addicted to orange chicken, and my childhood hero was Yao Ming. But having grown up in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Idaho, all states with incredibly little racial diversity, it was difficult to reconcile my so-called exotic Chinese heritage with my mainstream American self. Used to being the only Asian in the room, I was self-conscious that the first thing people noticed about me was that I wasn't white. And as a child, I quickly began to realize that I had two options in front of me: conform to the stereotype that was expected of me, or conform to the whiteness that surrounded me. There was no in between. For me, this meant that I always felt self-conscious about being good at math because people would just say it was because I was Asian and not because I actually worked hard. It meant that whenever a boy asked me out, it was because he had the yellow fever and not because he actually liked me. It meant that for the longest time, my identity had formed around the fact that I was different, and I thought that being Asian was the only special thing about me. These effects were emphasized by the places where I lived. Don't get me wrong, only a small percentage of people were actually racist or even borderline racist, but the vast majority were just a little bit clueless. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what's the difference? Well, here's an example. Not racist can sound like I'm white and you're not. Racist can sound like I'm white, you're not, and that makes me better than you. But clueless sounds like I'm white, you're not, and I don't know how to deal with that. Now, I don't doubt for a second that these clueless people are still nice individuals with great intentions, but they do ask some questions that become pretty annoying after a while. Here are a few examples. You're Chinese? Oh my goodness, I have a Chinese friend. Do you know him? No, I don't know him. Because contrary to your unrealistic expectations, I do not know every single one of the 1.35 billion Chinese people who live on planet Earth. People also tend to ask, where does your name come from? And I really don't know how to answer that, so I usually just stick with the truth. My parents gave it to me. Where does your name come from? Don't even get me started on how many times people have confused me with a different Asian person. One time, someone came up to me and said, "Angie, I love your artwork," and I was super confused, so I just thanked them and walked away. But out of all of the questions, my favorite one is still the classic, "Where are you from?" Because I've lived in quite a few places, so this is how the conversation usually goes. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Boise, Idaho. I see, but where are you really from? I lived in South Dakota for a while. Okay, what about before that? I lived in North Dakota. Okay, I'm just gonna cut straight to the chase here. I guess what I'm saying is, have you ever lived anywhere far away from here where people talk a little differently? Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yes, I have. I used to live in Texas. By then, they usually have just given up and wonder to themselves why I'm not one of the cool Asians like Jeremy Lin or Jackie Chan, or they skip the needless banter and go straight for the "where is your family from?" So just an FYI for all of you out there, that is the safest strategy. But as amusing as these interactions were, oftentimes they made me want to reject my own culture because I thought it helped me conform. I distanced myself from the Asian stereotype as much as possible by degrading my own race and pretending I hated math. And the worst part was, it worked. The more I rejected my Chinese identity, the more popular I became. My peers liked me more because I was more similar to them. I became more confident because I knew I was more similar to them. But as I became more and more Americanized, I also began to lose bits and pieces of myself, parts of me that I could never get back. And no matter how much I tried to pretend that I was the same as my American classmates, I wasn't. Because for people who have lived in the places where I lived, white is the norm, and for me, white became the norm too. For my 14th birthday, I received the video game Sims 3, which lets you create your own characters and control their lives. My 14-year-old self created the perfect little mainstream family, complete with a huge mansion and enormous swimming pool. I binge played the game for about 3 months and put it away and never really thought about it again until a few weeks ago when I came to a sudden realization. The family that I had custom designed was white. The character that I had designed for myself was white. Everyone I had designed was white. And the worst part was, this was by no means a conscious decision that I had made. Never once did I think to myself that I could actually make the characters look like me. Without even thinking, white had become my norm too. The truth is, Asian Americans play a strange role in the American melting pot. We are the model minority. Society uses our success to pit us against other people of color as justification that racism doesn't exist. But what does that mean for us Asian Americans? It means that we aren't quite similar enough to be accepted, but we aren't different enough to be loathed. We are in a perpetually gray zone, and society isn't quite sure what to do with us. So they group us by the color of our skin. They tell us that we must reject our own heritages so we can fit in with the crowd. They tell us that our foreignness is the only identifying characteristic of us. They strip away our identities one by one until we are foreign but not quite foreign, American but not quite American, individual, but only when there are no other people from our native country around. I wish that I had always had the courage to speak out about these issues. But coming from one culture that avoids confrontation and another that is divided over race, how do I overcome the pressure to keep the peace while also staying true to who I am. And as much as I hate to admit it, oftentimes I don't speak out, because if I do, it's at the risk of being told that I'm too sensitive, or that I get offended too easily, or that it's just not worth it. But at what point are people willing to admit that, yes, race issues are controversial, but that's precisely the reason why we need to talk about them? I just turned 18, and there are still so many things that I don't know about the world. But what I do know is that it's hard to admit that you might be part of the problem, that all of us might be part of the problem. So instead of giving you a step-by-step guide on how to not be racist towards Asians, I will let you decide what to take from this talk. All I can do is share my story. My name is Canwin, my favorite color is purple, and I play the piano, but not so much the violin. I have two incredibly supportive, hardworking parents, and one very awesome 10-year-old brother. I love calculus more than anything, despise eating rice, and I'm a horrendous driver. But most of all, I am proud of who I am. A little bit American, a little bit Chinese, and a whole lot of both. Thank you.
Sorry about that. All right. So when I first watched this, there were a lot of things that I kind of pulled out that I heard before. A lot of things that I think are stereotypes, but I would love to just kind of hear what your initial reaction was to this video. Maybe some of those similar sentiments or something different that you noticed.
I'll share. So I've absolutely been called another Black girl's name before, like seriously, by people who I've worked with or supervised or anything. And I look nothing like that person, but they've called me that person. So I definitely resonated with that, and also resonating, of course, with the different stereotypes that people just assume are going to be attributed to you based on your identities, what your interests are, and then wanting to rebel as much as possible, which then kind of still forces you into a box, and you not realizing in that moment that what other people think of you shouldn't have an impact on what it is that you're trying to do. But that's the society we live in, and we're trying so hard not to play into stereotypes that we end up then like rejecting even those identities that could be salient for us. So I resonated with all of that.
Yeah, Leah, I think that's a really great point, especially in thinking about being put in that box and just how much of yourself you can lose. And I think Cameron said, like, some things I'll never get back. So I have friends who like choose not to learn their native language as a way to try to be in the box. And those are things now they wish that they would have done. So I also resonated. Kayla.
Yeah, I'm sure this was filmed prior to COVID, given the number of people in the audience. And it's sad to think that her examples of racism that her community has faced have been 10 times, if not more, worse over this last year. And I think also our definition of what racism is has changed a little bit since she did this stand-up speech. I think that, you know, there's more of a focus now on being like anti-racist and like really doing the work than just like the people that she kind of gave excuses for. I think at this point now we've all should know better.
Yeah, I think there was a point in there where she called them clueless. And I thought that was very interesting, because I think for me, it was more like it's still kind of the impact, although the intent isn't there, it's still the same as saying, you know, you're white, I'm Asian, and that makes you better than me. So I kind of, I 100% agree with you in those comments, Kayla. Any other things that were noticed in this? Oh, you're muted, Vinny.
as a white male, I mean, I don't quickly identify experiences that are very similar, though I'm certainly familiar with them secondhand, right? And what I hear in her story are very similar to experiences that I've heard from many Asian Americans, and particularly South Asian Americans that I've worked with, but Asian Americans broadly. And so the specific things that she's identifying, that sense of sort of always being your location always being called into question, like you're always a possible foreigner, because of how you look. That's a very familiar, that's a very recurring, theme among Asian Americans. The pressure to assimilate, of course, is an obvious one. But I guess what I might highlight there too, and I'm making some assumptions about her experience, but it's based upon, a more general awareness, is in part because of the relative small size of the Asian American communities. Unless they're living in which are relatively few places, particularly in the West, right? But unless they're living in a community where there's a relatively high population, then they're especially minoritized, right? I mean, then they may not even have a local identity, a local community, right, to connect to help to support that identity. And so those pressures for assimilating and that feeling of like having to reject or hide your family culture, right, are especially strong, because nowhere else are you seeing that outside of the home, like being affirmed, right? And so that's something that I've seen pretty widely.
It's almost like assimilation for survival. If one is to not assimilate, what does that mean for emotional and physical safety?
Yeah.
Great.
So, do you want me to address this? You want me to go ahead, Chelsea?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so, we put together this slide, to highlight some general points about the experiences of the Apida community, historically and into the present. And, without doing an exhaustive history or overview of those experiences, but to highlight some things, right? And so we've already been talking about, and she articulated very well, what are some common stereotypes. She highlighted that reality of the model minority myth and how it can do kind of both damage to non-Apida folks, right, to other minoritized folks, especially, right, but also though it's not a positive identity or positive mythology for Apida folks, right? And then as we're talking about kind of the different kinds of prejudice and racism that occur, right? Some more she spoke. I think I interpreted the clueless as like microaggression kind of stuff, right? But also, as we'll highlight, and as has been highlighted more recently in our own media environment, significant hate crimes and violence, and those happen at certain historical moments, sometimes more than others. They happen all along. Sometimes it's the historical moment that sort of brings it to a broader attention. But for example, following the September 11th attacks, particularly South Asian Americans who were sort of interpreted as Muslim American, which there's nothing, of course, wrong with, but for those seeking retribution, and defining it in terms of those identities, there were some South Asian Americans who were not Muslim who were targeted, and the most noted example of that was Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was a store owner, I think a gas station owner in Arizona, who was shot. Someone who felt that they had to seek retribution in a confused and deranged way for the 9/11 attacks, saw a man who, as a part of his religion, wore a turban. Part of his religion that's tied to South Asia, that's not Islam, tied to Sikhism, and shot him because of that. And there are many other examples of that, of South Asian American communities in particular being targeted after September 11th. And, of course, we've been hearing a lot about the response to the COVID pandemic and the othering of Chinese Americans in particular, and in terms of locating naming it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, right, by our political leadership even, in ways that singled out, in ways that stigmatized, and in ways that just provided a kind of permission to others who would be inclined to that, right, to express that and enact that. So those are some of the recent things, but for little pieces of history, of course, it's important to know that the first exclusionary immigration acts in the U.S. were against Chinese Americans, were against Chinese who were trying to become Americans. The Page Act basically excluded Chinese women, and the Chinese Exclusion Act not long after that, excluded Chinese more broadly. The Japanese Americans, are the only group in the context of warfare that, in significant numbers, there are some smaller exceptions, but in significant numbers, were detained because of their heritage, right? And these are folks who may have been in the U.S. for generations, right, and owned property and businesses, and got sent off to camps, and sometimes lost their businesses, right, and lost their properties as a result of that. That happened for Japanese Americans. In 1982, Vincent Chen was a Chinese American in Detroit at a time when the rise of the Japanese motor industry in particular, and competition with Asia economically, was much in the news. And it was an altercation in a bar. It was a fight about, celebrating his upcoming wedding, but he was signaled out, and words were said, and the abuse occurred, was justified because he was taking their jobs, right? Was the language that was used, right? That it was the economic competition that was used to justify someone's murder. And what was most significant about this, beyond that horrible act, was that the folks, the men who did it, were arrested, were clearly, it was clear who did it, and they were convicted, but the I forget what exactly the penalty, but it was virtually nothing, right? They got off without significant punishment. So this was actually a key moment in kind of defining Asian American political activity, or and Apida community identity, because particularly because he wasn't even Japanese American. Not that any Japanese American should suffer that, but he wasn't a Japanese American. So it reinforced the stereotype that to other Americans, white Americans in particular, it doesn't matter whether you're Korean or Cambodian or Japanese or Chinese, you're all the same, and you're going to be treated the same, on the basis of that. And then most recently we have, the Atlanta Massacre. Again, what the specific motivations of the shooter was, are still not exactly known. But the bottom line is, Asian American women were killed, and to an Asian American community that is already suffering and feeling is being persecuted, right? It is a horrific act that has unique significance that is not going to be forgotten. And that is the most dramatic of these of recent times. But as AAPI hate organization collecting reports about hate crimes against Asian Americans, Apida community has stated, there have been as many as 3,800 incidents in the past year, mostly verbal altercations, but many of them physical. We've seen videos of people being shoved to the ground and beaten in ways that are horrifying, but part of a much longer history of racism and violence against Asian Americans and the Apida community broadly. So any comments, any questions about that history or those stereotypes, the model minority myth?
I just wanted to comment briefly on what you brought up about, again, like folks specifically, like we're obviously talking in a US based context because that's where we are, but folks not recognizing that Asia is made up of more than just two countries. Like there's a ton of identities that are a part of that. And I just think about, as an example, at my previous institution, we won't say where because we're recording, but I worked in an office that was meant to support students of color. However, the Apida community was not a focus of that office at all until 2017. And it wasn't until we started having conversation with students that we recognized the issue in just lumping all students as Asian without a better understanding of where specifically they were from. And therefore we were missing a huge demographic to provide support to that needed very similar support as the other communities that we were working with. But based on how we were collecting data, it didn't look like they needed the same support because they were being lumped in with other groups that did not need the same support, but there were smaller communities. So I think about that a lot, and how even like a lot of times we're well-intentioned in trying to figure out where folks are from, but we still miss the mark a lot in terms of what that support looks like. And we're not willing all the time to like do the work that we need to do to figure out what the nuances are within those larger communities. Like all Black people are not the same, right? All white people are not the same. And I feel like we're getting to a point where folks can see that for certain racial identities, but for others, we're still having to work on this. Like every Asian person you see is not Chinese or Japanese. Like there are so many other identities and languages, et cetera. So that's something I wanted to touch on. And then also just having, I worked with, at the University of Delaware, my coworker, also known as my ex-work husband now, since we don't work there anymore. But he would always tell stories about how, as a Chinese American born and raised in New Jersey, that people would constantly, whenever he explained where he was from, being New Jersey, would constantly confront him with additional digging questions about like, but really, like, where are you from? And he's like, New Jersey, like I just told you. And so I've definitely like heard secondary accounts of that, and also seen how, again, that model minority myth affects people. Going back to my previous role, like essentially all Asian students were being lumped into oh, they're smart, they have access to resources, they have money. If they're here, it's because their parents can afford it. It's because all of these things. And that's harmful, right? Because it removes opportunities from those folks who need it. Like some people, you know, I am of the mindset that stereotypes come from somewhere. It's not appropriate to stereotype people, but someone saw something one day and decided to ascribe that to everyone. And that is ascribing it to everyone is the problem. Right. Because those people do exist. And there are people who are privileged, who do have access, who do have resources, but we shouldn't be placing labels on people without knowing who they are and what they need. And so I think that that's something specifically from a collegiate standpoint that is most harmful to Asian identified folks, is that the assumption is that they're fine all the time, versus I think some other historically marginalized groups, because of the history of the United States being a little bit more discussed, still not enough, still not accurately, still not comprehensively, but because of their history being documented in a different way, people are more willing to see where that support what that looks like on an institutional level. But for Asian students, that's not the case, because we're assuming that they're all fine all the time, and that's not true.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of specifics to that. You know, so I mean, it is true that on average, the average income of Asian American households is above the average and is above white Americans. That's due to complexity of immigration history and having the wherewithal to be able to immigrate halfway across the world, and the you know the education and connections to make that possible. But you know, significant portions of the Apida community came to the U.S. as refugees, and you know, particularly out of Southeast Asia. And so, you know, there are stories of trauma and dislocation, and like the Hmong in particular. You know, there are some communities in Southeast Asia that assisted the U.S. in the Vietnam War, but they weren't generally educated urbanites within their own societies. And so in coming to the U.S., just face challenges, like few other groups, right? But to see their experience through those Asian American stereotypes is just, you're just missing everything, right? And in the specific ways that you're saying, you're not recognizing the needs, right, of those folks who, of course, it depends upon the particular, but very much in need of all kinds of assistance and help, to overcome those challenges.
One thing I'll add quickly is just also working with different student groups just in my past experiences. One of them was a group called Asian Students in Alliance. And we talked a lot about how sometimes that support isn't there, and it's also somewhat taboo in their culture to ask for that help. So it was kind of this continuous cycle, and I always think in my mind of like, okay, so if the resources aren't being offered, resources aren't being asked for, how much suffering is really happening? So that is something I think just as a practitioner that I've really tried to think through when specifically looking at students who identify within the Apida community.
Yeah, I also put this in the chat, but just thinking, we have this really problematic way of thinking here where we assume that everyone's lives look the same as ours. Because we're not seeing via media that there are different options, but even thinking about household income, like who's in your household though?
Right.
Like for me, I grew up in a single parent family for most of my schooling years. However, before fourth grade, we lived with my grandparents. So if I was still living with my grandparents and my mother when I went off to college, I'm sure that expected family contribution would have looked way different.
Right.
And people don't even consider just, again, those relationships. Like I think there are certain communities in Asian Apida identified folks fall into this that have intergenerational households.
Yes.
So again, just because the household income is higher, there are nuances. Right. And we miss that. Like it can be higher, but that doesn't mean that they don't have more responsibilities, more financial needs, more things. But again, we're trying to make things that don't fit into these particular systems. So I also wanted to just name that because I think we forget that there are folks who grew up with grandparents, uncles, aunties, cousins, all under the same roof.
Right.
And so, yes, it's going to look like they have more money on paper, but who's being taken care of, who's being housed, it may not actually be the case.
You want me to address this?
Yeah, so I think here now we're just really talking through what's being done about this. As we were kind of preparing this presentation, Vinny has some great information that I wasn't even aware was actually happening. So I'm happy to see that there are some things that are taking place, and we'll kind of walk through these, and we'd love to hear if you all have anything that maybe you've heard or seen, whether locally, nationally, internationally, to kind of combat some of these negative experiences that have been taking place within the Apida community.
I mean, it really is just a striking moment where, I mean, it is Apida Heritage Month. It's a bit of a coincidence in terms of what's been happening and the response, right? But that there is this national level discussion, and at least some significant effort to respond is I think a significant shift, and I hope, I think is one that will continue. We should always be wary, of course, of political rhetoric and passing of bills that don't have an effect. But the bills, for example, the bill before the Senate today, was put forth by Asian American senators, right? That this is not simply a symbolic act, but something that was created to in a variety of ways to have real effects tied to like the Justice Department initiatives and things like that. But to me, that's the most significant thing, is just that it's being talked about. And my sense is that's what you hear most clearly among the Apida community, is both for their own people within the community, but of course people outside the community too, you know, to be talking about it, to be listening, to be giving it an attention that, you know, most would say is long overdue, and especially in the past year.
And I think too, it's very interesting also seeing other individuals who don't identify within the Apida community kind of learn more and speak up more, and support a lot of the things that are happening, especially in those places where maybe there aren't many members of the community, but we still know that these things are wrong. So I sometimes think it's very easy to kind of sweep things under the rug if it isn't directly impacting your community. But I think with social media, keep doing this, with social media and things, it's a lot easier for us to be aware and then decide what we're going to do about those things next. All right. So some things that we can do is to really just learn, listen, learn, and don't be silent. So sometimes I think the listening is where we kind of stop. And so really figuring out how we can move that to be more action-based. And then Vinny has some great resources here for you all to review to kind of figure out how we can move some of these listening and learning to that action.
Yeah, and the first two are really more advocacy based, so like addressing the contemporary scene and you know, how to respond now. The other three are more sort of, you know, general information, very good general informational sites, learning more about the community history more broadly.
And finally, we definitely want to share some upcoming events that are happening on campus. Tomorrow we have our student recognition night. So this is typically the Student Leadership Awards. Students haven't had as many opportunities to showcase their leadership this year, so we want to celebrate them in a slightly different way, and that will be held on Zoom. There's also going to be a cooking demo on the 27th in Second Belk, hosted by Sodexo in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So very excited for that. Still celebrating Apida Heritage Month. And then last day of classes festival. So some students for some reason think we're not doing this year. We are doing it in a very safe and fun way. So it will start at 9 a.m. and it will go until 9 p.m. We have a concert, food truck, a lot of safe things that are happening on campus. That same day, we will also be celebrating Denim Day. Highlighting rather and raising awareness for Denim Day. So if there are any questions about these upcoming events, please feel free to let me know. I'd be more than happy to share more details. And finally, thank you all so much. If you have questions about the presentation, anything that you heard, the video that you saw, we'd be more than happy to share these resources out.
Thank you guys, this is awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, please don't hesitate, anybody else who might be hearing this, to reach out, to connect, to share, to ask questions, however you'd like to.
And we will, like I said, put it on the WPU Student Life Instagram page, as well as it will be in the Pacer that goes out every Monday. So please feel free to watch there.